Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Nick Neely, an assistant professor here at Eastern Oregon University, and welcome to the Sandra and Carl Elston Ars Poetica Fun reading and conversation featuring poet and memoirist E.J. Koh, who's here with us tonight. And we're gonna wait just a minute so that people can sift in and get settled, and then we'll get going in earnest. So grab a drink or a pretzel and see you in a few. In the meantime, I'm going to drop a couple links to future Ars Poetica readings that we're hosting this spring. The first is by novelist Jamie Harrison on April 29th, and the second by Sierra Crane Murdoch, a literary journalist, on May 20th, in each case a Thursday. And just going to put those links in the chat so that you can register now if you're interested, and I hope you'll tune in. Okay, thanks again for joining us. We'll get started now. I wanted to begin with a brief land acknowledgement since many of us are here in La Grande, where EOU is sited. We humbly acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land Eastern Oregon University is upon, the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Nez Perce people. We celebrate their traditions, languages, and stories. We acknowledge their continuing connection to this land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original stewards of Northeastern Oregon. Thank you. And now it's a real pleasure to introduce E.J. Koh to you tonight, who is beaming in from Seattle. And it's a particular pleasure for me because E.J. and I studied poetry together briefly in several classes while in graduate school in New York City. And it's been really wonderful to see her memoir receive so much deserved attention these past few years, and to reconnect with her now. EJ is the author of the memoir, The Magical Language of Others. I don't know if you can see that here. From Tin House Books. It was the winner of a Pacific Northwest Book Award and longlisted for the PEN Open Book Award. She's also the author of the poetry collection, A Lesser Love, from Louisiana State University Press, winner of the Pleiades Press Editors Prize for poetry. She's the editor of Pleiades Poetry by Korean American Women and co-translator of Yi Wan's The World's Lightest Motorcycle, which is forthcoming from Zephyr Press. Koh earned her MFA at Columbia University in creative writing and literary translation. She's completing her PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle for English language and literature on Korean and Korean American literature, history, and film. I just briefly about the magical language of others. Tin House says of it, the magical language of others is a powerful and aching love story in letters from mother to daughter. After living in America for over a decade, E.J. Koh's parents returned to South Korea for work, leaving 15-year-old E.J. and her brother behind in California. Overnight, E.J. finds herself abandoned and adrift in a world made strange by her mother's absence. Her mother writes letters in Korean over the years seeking forgiveness and love. Letters E.J. cannot fully understand until she finds them years later hidden in a box. As E.J. translates the letters, she looks to history, her grandmother June's years as a lovesick wife in Daejeon. Am I saying that right? The loss and destruction of her grandmother Kumiko, witnessed during the Jeju Island massacre, and to poetry, as well as her own lived experience to answer questions inside all of us. Where do the stories of our mothers and grandmothers end and ours begin? How do we find words in Korean, Japanese, English, or any language to articulate the profound ways that distance can shape love? EJ is so kind to be with us tonight to read and talk about this memoir, and if we're lucky, she may also share a few poems. She'll read for us, then I'll have some initial questions for her, and we'll have a little conversation. And we warmly invite your questions too. Please put them in the Q&A box so we know to look for them there. Thanks everyone for being here again, and take it away, EJ. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was so wonderful. And thank you for having me too. It's so nice to get connected again and see all the work you've been doing. So really glad to be here. I'm going to start with one of my mother's letters I translated. Something maybe to know is that she calls me by my Korean name, Eunji. For her, she calls herself mommy in the third person, almost as a way of mothering me from a distance. And it no matter how I age or get older, it keeps me at the age in which she left the country. Hi, Eunji. You got back from school, okay? Don't be too sad. Mommy is sorry for leaving you so young. Until the last of my life, Mommy's heart will ache. And you know, you've always been so strong, but this time, Eunji was crushed. Mommy's committed a grave sin against Eunji. Thoughts like this come to mind. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Even so, I want you to forgive Mommy. Save your energy and have some fun instead. Eunji is having a hard time while Mommy is asking Eunji to live brightly, freely, enthusiastically for me. That's selfish, like a wish, isn't it? Mommy will get back to Korea and write again. Eunji will miss me too much. I want to tell you I love you. And I want to tell God, thanks for letting me have my daughter, Angela. Eunji, don't cry when Mom is not with you. Whenever you are lonely or sad, then sleep as you said, right? My Eunji, you've done great so far. Now, there's not much time left. Keep it up. If Eunji doesn't enjoy her life, the rest of my life won't be just sad, but each and every day I will feel regret and it'll be hell. Eunji is smarter than Mommy, stronger than Mommy, so Eunji can do this for me, okay? Please, let's say aja aja, fighting, okay? Eunji, Mommy loves Eunji a lot and personally, I like Eunji. Good looking, lovable, kind, courageous. Down the road, whoever is the one to marry my Eunji is a person born with all the luck in the world, right? Eunji, let's live as diligently as possible. If you want to live to 133 years, then you must prepare yourself. Mommy too, when she goes back to Korea, she'll live earnestly. I will only drink Coke when I truly want to. Otherwise, I'll restrain myself. Each and every day I will, for sure, take a walk and stay healthy. I'll also study my Japanese. My Eunji, you too, you must take good care of yourself. You know this, right? Eunji, bye. I'm going to read just the last two sections of one of the chapters that Nick suggested I read, so I really wanted to read from it. What's happened at this point is I left for Southern California and I became a hip hop dancer. I joined a dance crew and a competitive hip hop dance crew and performed around the state actually and all over. And I after my grandmother died, I quit, and I had been going through a lot of sort of problems. I Before that, I was still sort of wrestling with the eating disorder, and I was drinking and doing lots of drugs. But I think once I quit dance, I just didn't know quite what to do, and I wasn't sort of doing so well in school. And then I met the school counselor, I want to say my junior year of undergraduate school, and I had one breath requirement left, and it was math. It was mathematics, and I just couldn't take that class. It was too hard for me, and so she recommended that I substitute another class to fulfill my mathematics requirement, and she chose Introduction to Poetry. So I went to my first day of class, and I'm just starting to get settled in here. Our class met in the trailer twice a week in the late afternoon. Every day we met, I left only to come back. We had lost a third of our class who had dropped out on the first day, but those of us who stayed rose from our seats, waited, and listened. Normally the windows steamed, but we opened the door and the wind came in. Toward the end, we lay our foreheads on our desks, lulled to say anything at all, just as we would in the seconds before sleep, until the clip of somebody's voice stirred us. Poetry is to say what must be said, and nothing more? The truth can't come with tassels. What if the truth is easier with tassels? If you don't want the truth, why read poetry? Joe, my teacher, staring at the thermostat on the wall, opened the lid of his coffee cup and washed the last drops down. Closer, he said. What are we doing? We're arguing? We're paying attention, Joe said. Whenever he spoke, his words were sets of clothes that we tried on for ourselves. Sometimes they fit, and other times they were old and baggy. We're looking up close. Everybody can look, can't they? Joe took a deep breath. I don't know, but you have to care. Those of you who've decided to stay and try this out, it's because you care. The bell rang through the speaker. It was quiet again, and night came out of nowhere. We were surprised to learn we still had our mouths, our legs and arms, our hearts. I met with Joe at the coffee shop for office hours. He refilled his cup and returned to the table. Nothing seemed as real outside the trailer, and Joe agreed. He took my papers from me. Wait, how many poems? I don't know, I said. Maybe 40? When did you write these? I almost had not returned after the first day of class. I had been convinced that I would not until I got back to my room. You wrote all night, Joe said, laughing. I wish I could do that. He set his cup down at the edge of the table so he would not stain the papers. He read through them with a pen in his hand. Joe asked me, "Is your mom still alive?" I nodded. To be honest, he said, I don't know how to say this. I'm being mean to her? No, he said, there's no magnanimity. It was my first time hearing the word. Do you need proof? What would I do with proof? Joe cautioned. Then he pointed to the page. Actually, there's somebody who can say it better than me. He gestured to the wall behind me and traced out the shape of the building that lay beyond it. When I looked for myself, he reassured me, this is your first writing class, isn't it? I'm going to arrange for you to meet the director of the writing program. Her name is Joy, and she won't believe these are your poems. Writing a poem I came out of absolute darkness. Hundreds of poems I wrote about my mother and grandmother, desperate to write down those who only ever appeared in my head. I hoped for a future with poems and to be alone with them. My mother left voicemail saying she wanted to hear my voice. My roommate knocked on my door, laughing nervously, checking that I was not a dead body, but it was the opposite. At my desk, I felt grateful and alive. I rounded the stairwell to the top floor of a campus building and pushed through a green door into an office where light streamed through a window. In a chair facing the window, Joy was waiting for me. She was middle-aged with short brown hair and pale skin and wore a skirt over riding boots. Her glasses hung from a necklace chain. She must have been thinking deeply because her fingertips arched over her forehead. "It's quiet," Joyce said, and motioned for me to take a seat. "I like it since I have to read out loud whatever I put down on paper. You have to hear yourself. Say it in the open, or you forget you're really saying something." Joy was so quick, and her instructions so precise. Read everything, hold it out in front of you, and just go. She touched her throat and said, "It's here." She tapped my poems on her desk. "Not here." Joy read one page, and I could hear my poem. "What does your mother call you?" Joy asked me. "Unji." "I've been reading your poems," Joy said, pushing away from her desk. She described her daughter to me as she showed me a photograph, and telling me what love felt like to her. She was as careful as anyone could be. "The poems you wrote before are unforgiving," Joy told me. "You don't have to forgive your mother. I'm not telling you to forgive her. But the poem must forgive her, or the poem must forgive you for not. Otherwise, it's not a poem." "Like magnanimity?" I asked. She put her hands on the table. "Yes, magnanimity," she said. "You can say anything you want with magnanimity. We are poets, aren't we?" "We don't have a lot of things. We have poems," she said. "Do we live on just words?" "No," she said, laughing. "Nobody can do that." I asked, "Does a poet have to be reasonable?" Joy opened a file with my name across the top. "Forgiveness doesn't need a reason. It doesn't follow a logical thought, so it frees you from having to be reasonable." She shuffled through the first pages. "I'm your advisor from now on," she said. "We are changing your courses and adding the requirements for our department. You must show up and do the work. We have very little time. We're going to stack your quarters. You will be here all summer. There are 2 or 3 big awards coming up. You will apply for them today. These poems you have will work. You're interning at the Translation Center, aren't you? You will meet and learn from poets. Joe knows that you're very good. I know that you can grow, but you can't forget what I'm about to tell you." I agreed. "I'll call you Unji," Joy asked. "No teacher before or ever since called me by that name." "You can say whatever you want, if you reckon with it." Joy asked me to be relentlessly forgiving and magnanimous toward all conditions of human life, and equally toward those of my own. She encouraged me to look closely and said poetry would teach me how to pay attention and show me how to care. I must choose love over any other thing. Then the world would open up for me. Do you see now? She asked me. That's why a poem is more than just words. It's why poets have everything. I'm going to read 2 short poems for you. Let's see. This poem I love to read alongside my memoir because it's the poem that inspired the memoir. It's the poem that begins the memoir. And the very first few lines are the same exact lines of the first page, the first intro to the memoir. So, Father in his old age. There is a Korean belief that you were born the parent of the one you hurt most. Watching my father use chopsticks to split chicken katsu, he confesses that I may be the reincarnation of his own father. We finish our waters in silence and walk home, chatting about who to blame for where we are. He says the present is the revenge of the past. Revenge goes too far, I argue. And in our unhappiness, we both want to know we cannot pay enough. Pain becomes meaning. After this life, I fear I'll never meet him again. I want to read this since I'm here with Nick and Timothy Donnelly, our sort of workshop leader, our teacher, professor, really likes this one. And so I wanted to, it's a little more wild. Ingredients for memories that can be used as explosives. I am not sad anymore. I am on the rooftop of my life, cheering until my body of hallways opens, jade and steaming. When a pope dies, tradition says to hit his head with a silver hammer 3 times to see if he's alive. Kum, 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 kum. I've been so many popes. The shells of laughing are cooked. Open the door and let them know I am not sad anymore. Not once carrying my lunch pail soul with bright green fingernails. Can a soul be excited to tears? That's the one time a soul is excited. I am together. Feel my forehead. I am young, but I always forget what I meant to say, except I am alive. And I will not jump from here because the wind is coming. It has a beak and a tooth and has heard I am not sad anymore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, EJ. I loved hearing the recount from your time as an undergraduate at UC Irvine and coming to poetry, because I think for creative writers, it captures a moment that many of us have felt, maybe in less dramatic ways, and also the connection with a teacher or a mentor, an advisor even, who steered us in the right direction and shown us a way out of darkness, which, in your case, that seems like it was really true. So thank you. And I'm glad you read that wild poem for Timothy Donnelly. He is such a great teacher. So I'm glad you brought him up. For those who haven't seen the book, it's an alternation basically of your translations of your mother's letters to you when she was in Korea and you were distanced back in California in Davis. And those translations you did many years after you received them, and you never knew that perhaps you would take on those translations as intentionally as you did. And then in between are your chapters that share your history and your family's history across time and across the ocean. You take us on trips to Korea and to Japan, where you studied Japanese. It's such a complex and beautiful form, also simple in the alternation. And so you describe ultimately in the book how late you, when you were reunited with your parents, you discovered the letters and you had forgotten about them. And you had studied translation at that point, and a mentor suggested you take it on as a translation project. And in the book, you even write about beginning to do that. But I'm curious, my first question for you is, when did you know that this would become a memoir in addition to translation? And was it right away? Was it as you were translated? Was it afterward when you had them all together? And then also, why the impulse suddenly toward memoir as opposed to poetry, which you began? Not to make too fine a distinction, but why did you tip into prose for this project?
So when I first started writing, I was working on a book of translation. So it never started as a memoir. It was going to be a book of 49 translations, all of them, with a 2-page introduction with the content that the memoir has now, but sort of summarized in the introduction. And I was aiming to just translate these letters, and I spent many years and sent them out, but I think I kept getting the same feedback, which was the letters are so important, but at the same time, they're important because of this context that you give. And it's such a rich and complicated one that begs to not be 200 pages, but 2 pages, but 200 pages. And so I scrapped what I had and went back and decided I would write 200 pages. So if you look at the memoir, it's almost exactly 200 pages, because at the time I was really having a tough way of stretching my summary into something longer. But yeah, I think I had a lot of help and lots of people guide me to try and get the context down and get the stories down that I wanted to get down. And those fit in between the 10 letters that I chose to represent the larger assembly of letters. So, yeah.
Very interesting. I'd be curious. I wonder whether the other 39 letters will ever see the light of day publicly in some fashion. That would be fascinating. I'm wondering, could you say more about how you dove in to prose? Did you start at the beginning? Chapter 2, which follows the first letter, really it gives context for your parents leaving America. Your dad was given the opportunity to take a high-profile job in Korea, and it seemed to make sense, certainly financially, and was a risk, but seemed worth taking. And in that chapter 2, you really show us sort of, maybe it's the darkest point, possibly the darkest point. It's the early days after they are leaving, and you're missing them. You write of, looking for your mother in the house, knowing she's not there, and you go to a park in Davis, thinking that you'll stay there all night and perhaps freeze to death. So you're in a real despair. So I'm just wondering, did you start at the beginning, or did you start in the middle in the prose, and how did that arrangement or the writing go?
Yeah. Hmm. Such a good question, and I love talking about this. I wrote the whole memoir, all the chapters, in how do you say, in order or sequentially, I guess. The stories themselves, they're not in order, but I wrote them in the order that you read them now. So it's almost like what happened was, in terms of that second chapter, I think I was looking for every forthcoming chapter to ask a new question and try to answer the question that the previous chapter was asking. So maybe the second chapter, in a way, says a lot of me, but it's asking, sort of in the shadow of that chapter, where's your mom? What's she doing right now? And then that's how we get into the next chapter in Korea. And in terms of, say, chapter 2, just writing everything out, I would say it had, I think some of the chapters I wrote very quickly, and they don't have too many changes, even from the very first draft. And those would be the chapters that have to do with my grandmothers, with Kumiko, my paternal grandmother, my maternal grandmother, June. But chapters like chapter 2 and the later chapters, they took me a really long time and a lot of revisions. And there was like sort of an accordion effect where I do write things down and then I cut and I look at the sections that that have the deepest relationships with each other. So what are the sections that speak to the other sections, and what can I remove? So I used to have sections that have to do with school, and those were important because I had faced a lot of bullying, and then I'd also encountered sexual assault, and those were, you would think, so essential to that. But what I focused on that chapter 2 was, for me, what do I remember the most, and what is the feeling I took away? And that's the one I wanted to give. And most of all, it was the feeling of waking up in a house and being alone and being a child and being a kid and not knowing what to do. I have so much time, and so much of that time I'm just alone.
Yeah.
So it made me hone in on, okay, this is what I'm actually wanting to write about. And I'm going to focus on those sections. And for me, maybe I don't write so much like this anymore, but it really helped to have sections, to not have such long breaths of writing, but shorter ones that let me focus, almost like I'm looking at stanzas in a poem, to say, this is what I'm saying here, and this is what this is saying, and this is what they're saying to each other. And so it was, I don't know, it was, and I wasn't as thoughtful as I'm being now, trying to articulate what I was doing. It felt at the time of writing that I was just writing, right? Writing, and cutting, and then writing again.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I was gonna ask you about, to what extent your innumerable practice and form via poetry, how you felt that enabled you to construct this complicated and yet beautifully simple memoir with a kind of refrain of the letters. But you answered that, I think. But on the question of, you spoke of, some of the middle chapters are about generations in the past, your great grandmother and grandfather, and both of your grandmothers in particular. And you said you wrote those all in one sweep. But then it seems clear, you're sort of tracing the idea of inheritance, right? The inheritance both of trauma and also of certain personalities, and how that can go directly from one generation to the next, or as the poem you wrote, brings up the Korean adage, maybe skip a generation and be reborn. So I'm curious how did you know from the start that you were going to take on this family history? Was that something that had emerged in your poetry, and you knew you were headed there? Or was it an epiphany in your thinking through the letters that you were reading? I know your mother mentions her family often in those letters. She's reconnecting with them in a deep way and reliving all that history back in Korea after, I think, 17 years, right, in America, in California. That's a big question, but when did family enter in such a bold way?
Such a great question. I'm having a great time, by the way. I don't know why I'm enjoying myself way too much. I just love getting the chance to chat with you. I think because I wrote them in order, what happened was I must have been saying, this is who I am. And then the next chapter with my mom is saying, to understand me, you have to understand my mom. And then I probably, when I get to the end of that chapter, I realize, okay, to understand my mom, you have to know her mom. You have to know my mom as a daughter to somebody else, to try and get to the present day problems and why they are so fraught and troubled. So it seemed natural to, as we go forward in the book, to go backwards, to trace, okay, my mother has, we end with my chapter with my sort of suicide attempt, and throughout the book there's quite a bit of suicidal ideation. And then we see that, I grew up with that. It was quite normal for me. My mother had that, and in fact her mother, it was even much more dramatic, and we don't see where every maybe little bit of me that comes out have these sort of web-like connections to the past. And so I think I don't think I thought too much about it, except that I knew that I needed to write that for us to get down to the issues that I have with my mother.
Thank you. One final question sort of about the form, and then there's some great questions coming in from the audience that I want to bring up. But, I found myself wondering whether, it would be appropriate for the reader to see those intervening chapters, your memoir, as a reply to the letters, and whether you were thinking of it in those terms. And the tone of the letters are written because at the time you didn't really, your Korean was very elemental. So she was writing in an elemental style, and they skew, let's say, young and cheerful, but they're very instructive at the same time. They admonish, they rally, and they ask for forgiveness, and they send love. And your memoir is a completely different tone, and it doesn't instruct very much, so there's sharp moments of insight. So it seems philosophically different, and I just wondered about that. Were these replies? Did you conceive it that way?
I think they can be read as replies. I think it can be seen as, at least subconsciously, I was replying to all the letters, especially these 10. An example would be when my mom starts naming off her family and introduces them and their ages, because she wants me to know. And we get to meet her side of the family a little more. But I was, even though that might have been a sort of lower consciousness level, I was very aware of the contrast of how my mother's letters read in a certain way, and her voice was quite different, and that my prose chapters, my memoir, the memoir aspect of it was so dark and deeply troubled. And so I was aware that that was creating a relationship between the letters and my words.
Mhm.
That was sort of adding more tension to the letters, and the letters doing the same to the in-between chapters. And I would say I depended on that to make sure everything was sewn together, I guess.
Wonderful. Yeah, you do create an enormous amount of tension through the alternation. Chelsea Waters, we're going to answer this question live, asks, you write about a class from an Irish poet and translator who says, quote, if you want to be a good poet, then write poetry. If you want to be a great poet, then translate. Chelsea wonders, how do you see translation influencing poetry? Is it because there is so much attention to word choice and nuance, or is it more than that? What does that quote from Noah, your instructor,
Yeah,
mean to you?
yeah. So Noah is from Colombia. It's Eamon Grennan, and I had his
I figured that out.
workshop, and I don't even know if he was saying that directly to me, but it felt like that. He said it to everybody, and I remember leaving that day and adding the translation degree because and not knowing what that meant and what it was. Just doing it on the spot. And I actually corresponded with him recently. I sent him a letter just thanking him because I ended up becoming a translator, and or soon after I found my mother's letters. So it seemed like everything up to that point was preparing me in some ways to read these letters. And that's interesting. I think I'm I'm still translating quite a bit now and finishing up a project, but I don't know. I think Eamon's words about the relationship between poetry translation is interesting because I think it's pointing to our relationship to language. Um, I think it points to, I don't know, I'm trying to think about how to articulate sort of when I'm thinking about anything, it's almost like the language I reach for to describe that thing is different based on what I'm talking about.
Mm.
And that is so enlightening because instead of sort of going at a subject or an object like a straight arrow, what happens is it's sort of covered in, let's say, like a triangulation of three languages instead of one. And those languages ping pong off each other and around this subject. And it adds sort of dimension and qualities that I might not have been so aware of on the surface.
Mm.
And so I'm really sensitive, I think, and maybe it's through translation. I'm not quite sure, just learning other languages, but really sensitive to words, to how we look at things. And I think that's an incredible thing for poetry. Like my poetry teacher said, all we're doing is looking at things. So language is a great thing to be a part of.
Yeah, I mean, I think translation, to my mind, and I'm not really a practicer of it by any means, is it seems to teach about uncertainty, right? Because for every word there are multiple possibilities, or there's no perfect possibility. When you bring that to your own work or poetry in particular, it opens things up. I found myself thinking about how you go to Japan to study language, which is an ancestral language for you too, and you're really still searching at that point. And it's only when you find poetry that things begin to settle and you find a vocation. And it just occurred to me that poetry was the way for you to translate your loss and your emotion. And so the poetry itself is a kind of a language.
Right, right.
So,
Seems to be the one that helped me finally speak and use a voice.
another question, this one from Alexander Ortega. He says, I love your reading, EJ. My question, I was so struck by your memoir about your first poetry class. Given that this is a memoir, not something you invented, what was invented per se important? What was your approach to imparting the rhythm and measured pacing in your prose, and in this piece in particular? It felt like it unfolds with incredible balance. And so maybe this question is also asking, how does poetry, come into your sentences?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I used to talk about this a lot more, and then I think I saw one of my old interviews. I just thought, oh God, I sound so pretentious when I get too into detail, because I can get really excited about bringing poetry and translation into prose. It's really exciting for me to, those memories I have in Japan, if you think about it, and even the dialogue, that's all in Japanese. So writing the prose is actually a part of the translation. And a lot of the phrases that I'm using, they're sort of cliches in Korean, but when I translate it into English, there's a newness about it and freshness. I think one of the characters says, your clothes are your wings, which is another way to say that, there's another phrase like clothes maketh the man, or it's a translation of that in another culture. So it's fun to bring translation in, and poetry comes in a similar way that I'm thinking of rhythm and pacing, but also quite visual in terms of I really enjoy block passages. I just can't help but look at the visual. So it's nice to hear me read the work. I think I read the audiobook, and that's really helpful to figure out how I'm pacing the reading. And I've heard that it's been enlightening to hear it, but I think it's also important to see the book, like see it on the page, because I tend to sort of chop and cut and groom things so that they have that block quality. And I like to see the shape. So if one paragraph is really big, I don't like the next paragraph being really small. I like them pretty evenly sized. So things like that they're just little ticks I have, right? They're not huge theoretical ideas I have on writing, but they're just things I like when I see a book. Yeah.
I'm so glad to know that you read the audiobook. I'm gonna listen to that when I have time, because you do really read as a poet, and I'm really glad to see that brought to prose, because even those who write very lyrically with breath in their sentences, when they read it, they tend to just kind of rush over it. And you bring out the voice and the breath in your work in a wonderful way. Here's a swerve of a question from Colette, and and coming back to an earlier art form for you, and maybe you still dance. Do you think that your experience dancing informed your writing? Do you still dance?
Yeah. Dancing helped me consider space on the page. I imagine it's similar with, it's called blocking in dance too, but it's sort of the formation that we might take on the stage. And that helped me look at poems in a really visual way. And things like rhythm and pace can come from playing with meters. That has some play from dancing. I do say that I think with dance, I was so strict. When you're in a crew, you want to be really clean, and you want to basically not be seen. You want to be a part of the crew and all the gestures and motions you make. And I think poetry was the opposite. Not that dance has to be that way. And I think lots of dancers are able to fully express themselves through dance.
Mhm.
For me, it took going into poetry to figure out, oh, there's something that's my own here that I can do. And that's not as clean. It can be a little messier and a little more wild. So do I dance today? I love to sort of dance and groove in my house and listen to music. I really I like exercise and just moving the body. Any form of moving the body has been helpful. So I think if I learned dance again, I would be more expressive now that I know how to be more myself in the things that I do.
A different kind of dance. Fascinating. Coming back to we've only got time for just a couple more questions, and I wanted to come back to the idea of your relationship with your mother and your relationship with poetry. You reunite. They come back after, I believe, 9 years away, or you were 9 years apart, and you moved back in with them in Washington State, and your dad had gone to Korea to work very hard, very intensely, and you yourself were working very intensely in poetry. You found your passion, and yet you come back together, and they did not see poetry as work, really, as a vocation. And in the memoir, we can see your mother opening up to that idea and understanding that it is touching a huge community. And I wondered if you could just say more about what that was like, and then if it's not too sensitive a subject, I'd be curious to hear too about your mom and your family's reaction to the memoir, which is a complicated family story, to say the least. And we know in memoir that's fraught with both with tension often.
I got the last question about my family's reaction, and just before that, you cut out a little bit, but was it about my parents coming around to poetry? My
Yes,
mother?
exactly.
Okay.
Because we see her coming around to it in the book, and she's changing as you are changing, and there's kind of maybe we could call it letting go in both directions, and maybe you could talk about letting go in the next. Sorry.
No, it's great. Let's see. I remember my mom had friends over in her living room, and they were from Korea, and they asked her, what does your daughter do? What does your daughter do? And my mom just sort of smiles and says, you wouldn't understand. And they're sort of pushing her, well, what does she do? What does she do for work? And she tells them, my daughter teaches people how to let go. And I think that was really important for me to hear that out loud and in front of other people, no less, that she wanted to impress. And there was something about poetry that she understood on a deeper level, maybe more than I gave her credit for at first. And yeah, I think what's interesting is, and I don't know if I was aware of this at the time, but now thinking about it and doing a lot of my research in Korean history and Korean poetry as well, Korea has so much poetry in a way, has so much music and poetry, and even after the war, an incredible political movement through poetry. And in a way, my parents leaving Korea at that time, I mean, they were leaving that poetry behind in a way. They knew, they've always known what poetry was. I just wasn't aware of Korean poetry at the time. And I think they knew better than I did what poetry can do. There's so many Korean political prisoners because of their poems, and they were executed. And so their insistence on finding work was in some part their wish for me to survive, or understanding. I mean, it wasn't that they thought poetry was small. It was that maybe they thought it was too big. It was a danger. And that's not something I was fully aware of. But that's really hard to know, especially as children of immigrants. You just think, oh, they don't care. They just want me to make money, which is a part of the answer. If you go back and you look at the whole history of a people, there's much more to that. And so that's been helpful. And in terms of my family's reaction to the memoir, I think I'm just really fortunate, and it makes me sad that not everyone could say that, but my family has responded so well, and they've been so supportive. I think what's funny is I worried here and there about what they might think about my writing about them. And it turned out that they didn't care about that at all. They didn't bring up the moments that I wrote about them. They really felt worried about the chapters where I'm just writing about myself, and I'm just writing about me. And because that's the stuff they didn't see and they didn't know and wish they had known. And so that was enlightening and important for me to discover, because now I can write about them all I want.
They should have said something. No. It's really beautiful in the book. Your mom, as she attends, some poetry events. I'm a little unstable here, but are you hearing me now?
Yeah.
Your vocation to poetry, your coming to poetry reconnects her with, or reconnects your family, I think, with your paternal grandmother, right? Who she says love poetry, and it's kind of an interesting bridge. It's kind of coming, she's connecting to her family too through your work.
Right.
Well, one last question, if you don't mind, which is just can you tell us, you're in a PhD program at the University of Washington. What are you researching there, and what are you writing about more generally, whether scholarly or creative, if you make a distinction?
Yeah. I'm researching, I guess it's Korean and Korean American literature and history and film, which is just so fun for me. I think the PhD program is really an excuse for me to just keep doing what I want to do, which is read books all day and write. And it turns out I get something for that in the end. But yeah,
I understand that.
it's a great, it's sort of my work in the program, my scholarly work and research, it feeds so well into my writing, into my poetry translation and prose. They sort of inform each other. And so I get a chance to really, maybe learn how to read better is something I was able to do, is read very widely, but I mean, reading hundreds of books on a subject and not being afraid of that, or not feeling held back or nervous or scared about reading. I think I wish I knew this earlier, but it's great that I know now, but how important reading is. And oh my goodness, just how helpful it is to read an extra 50 books if you're not sure about something. Just reading and also reading literature and reading the same book again to say, okay, I want to figure out what they're doing and I have questions, and enjoying that reading again and again. Building relationships with books, and especially Korean books and Korean American books, for me has been so special. And being able to read, let's say, all the Korean American literature and saying, well, what do I want to contribute? I'm sort of in a really fortunate position where I get to both generate and contribute to a field of writing. And that's been so wonderful, and being a part of that conversation, and also writing so that other people can have conversations about my writing. It's been nice. My specialization goes into trauma. It goes into a sort of shallower version of epigenetics, and Han, which is sort of the Korean, it's a Korean word that is considered a national characteristic of Korea, and it's considered untranslatable. It's supposed to be a sort of unimaginable grief and sorrow that's handed down from generation to generation, and you can have physical effects from it, like heart palpitation. And I would say it's similar to duende in poetry, the way we think of duende. So a little bit of this and that.
I just, thank you for saying that about reading, because I also still feel like I'm trying to fully commit to reading, and you just inspire me so much that I'm gonna do nothing but read for the rest of this evening. So thank you, and I'm excited to see what emerges from your scholarship. I recently saw an Instagram post, I think, from you of Korean American writing. There was several stacks, and it was really inspiring to see you and you contextualize your own work visually that way.
It's so fun, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, EJ, for joining us tonight. I really loved your reading and was pleased to chat with you, and thanks for everyone. I just wanted to remind you again about our two future Ars Poetica events this spring on April 29th and May 20th. Novelist Jamie Harrison and literary journalist Sierra Crane Murdoch. The links to register are at the top of the chat. And EJ, thank you so much. We'll hope to invite you to EOU in person when we can. And thank you everyone for attending, and have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Evan. Appreciate you in the background putting this together.
Thank you, Evan.